So, dear Charles Personnaz, perhaps I'll let you kick us off. Well, thank you, dear Juliet, for letting me kick off. As usual, we're just going to start off with thanking everybody, which is just totally natural and really underlines the extent to which we're really always delighted to come together with Icon France. But the discussion that we had before the discussion we're having with you was very fruitful, was very rich, and Julia, I want to thank you for these preparation times, and I want to thank the whole Icon France team who are making these events possible. You've also talked about the work that's done so that we can publish the minutes and the report of these discussions, and I use those notes a lot in order to remember a particular detail that's been mentioned by such and such a person during our events. So I kick off just with thanks this evening, and also greetings to all the speakers who will be participating this evening. They will come from a number of different professional backgrounds, but they all have a common mission, which is preserving the heritage of museums. All of our evenings that we organize together with Icon France are very important, but this one is perhaps even more important because it connects in with the specificity of our French National Heritage Institute, INP. We have curators for heritage and conservators trained within INP, and heritage restorers are also trained here. Part of our continuous and ongoing training. You know that we have about 100 training sessions a year for all of our professionals, heritage professionals in France. And here we go beyond the heritage chain, as it were. All of these different professions organized together have to be clearly defined and clearly identified so that the skills of different parties are recognized by other parties, and so that each profession is able to be clearly identified and work together. This is something we're really committed to because we understand that protecting collections is directly connected to our capacity for these different professions to work together. There needs to be a common way of working, there needs to be a common vocabulary, common approach, and that needs to start from the very beginning of the training. But this subject obviously goes beyond the INP. It is linked into the work of what everyone working in heritage in France to preserve collections, but this is a European issue, an international issue. Of course, we can look at the example of what we're thinking about within the European Commission at this time, to think about heritage professions and how these different professionals can be clearly defined, clearly recognized, clearly clarified in terms of their skill set and their job descriptions in order to be able to easily dialogue across countries and across different professions. So we are very obviously engaged in this European work. And then there is the specific work of the conservators that we are training. We are a training organization, but we are committed with regard to the French Federation for Conservation and Restoration to create a protected job title of conservators. We think this job needs to be clearly defined, not in an unhealthy competition with other people, other professions, but so that it can take its place within the heritage world. This is something that should not cause any concern for other professions, but actually this is about wanting to clearly define skills so that within specifications, within official documents, that we can have a clear official title, as this is the case across European countries. I'm going to stop there, but I just want to say again how much what we know in France and the landscape in France is likely to change, and it needs to change. This is right. Professions change. The protection of heritage and collections changes. Who might have thought that 40 or 50 years ago that the profession of conservator, of registrar would be what they have now become, how they are today? In order to take into account changes within the chain of professions and the care and to take properly care of collections, it really is very important as part of an evening like today, have time where we think about a number of new practices that are being implemented. We're seeing people's roles changing with more room left internally to conservators. How should that connect in with uh, curators, with registrars, with other professions? That's one of the key issues that we're really talking about tonight. Thank you to ICOM France for this opportunity to think about this, and all the participants who are here tonight. I think this is really going to be very interesting for the protection of the collections that are so dear to our hearts. I was going to wish you a good day, but I wish you an excellent evening, and we will talk soon. Thank you very much, Charles. You've clearly set out the scale of this debate. This is something that's really very important, thinking about the national level of these professions. And I know the extent to which the INP, French Heritage Institute, is really committed to working on these questions. Dear colleagues from ICOM France, ICOM International, because there's a whole number of you actually from all around the world already. We're 100 or so now connected. Dear Charles Personnaz, I'm delighted to introduce this session, which is going to be moderated by two people from the INP, Pauline Chassen and Amélie Métivier. I'd also just like to talk about our partnership with INP, which has been very fruitful. We've been working together for 5 years now. This is our 12th ethics evening. You said, Charles, that this is not it's not the be-all and end-all just to have this discussion, but we publish and we have a collection of publications from these evenings, and a number of you use these. I think that this partnership that we have developed is something that's really precious for all of us and really important for all of our professionals. Over these last few years, we've dealt with a number of different questions that are at the heart of museums, and that's what we're focused again on today. We could say that the question of collections, their conservation and restoration is a permanent subject, which is not necessarily something that's a current issue, but I would like to actually say how much this it is right that this debate is taking place today. Why? Because, first of all, within ICOM, it is today, or actually it's going to be tomorrow, that our international organization will be deciding on a definition of museum. You remember to what extent this debate around the definition of museum caused division, and it was around this question of the place of collections within museums. Collections were not seen as being at the heart of museums. Museums weren't being seen as places to preserve collections, but for other purposes. And yes, but we in France wanted to be focused on what brings us together, the common profession of preserving the tangible traces of what makes up the history of all of us and of sharing those traces. In saying this, of course, in evoking history and the objects that recall it, I'm thinking of the threatened heritage, actually the heritage that's not only threatened, but is being targeted, destroyed, and attacked on our doorstep in Ukraine. At the moment, UNESCO is giving us figures that were published 3 days ago. 133 cultural sites have been damaged, 57 religious sites, a number of museums, 26 historical sites, 7 libraries. You understand that these figures bring this reality very much home to us. Our debate this evening shows us that it is crucial because there are key professional issues here that we're working on, but it is really crucial too for our colleagues in Ukraine who have specifically asked us just 2 weeks ago when we were together on this Zoom platform with some of you here, they asked us for the first time 2 months ago, they asked us to help them to protect their collections. And 2 weeks ago, they asked us to help them restore their heritage because during this time of war, they are thinking about the future, thinking about how to put in place processes for restoration and already digitalize their, their collections. And they've asked us for help there. They've asked us to help them with materials, but also training in restoration because they feel the need of help. Together with Charles Personnaz and the Blue Shield organization, we are planning to respond to this, and we are thinking about what we could do, what remote training programs or perhaps face-to-face training programs we could offer, even though this is a challenge in war zones, of course. So today's subject is very pertinent. It's a current subject. If we think about conservation and preservation, we need to understand that they are at the heart of museums. But beyond being at the heart of museums, they are at the heart of what this nation of Ukraine is going to be able to live and rebuild itself. There are a number of us here who have responsibilities within ICOM. We should remember that ICOM was created for this purpose 75 years ago as we came out of the Second World War to help build a lasting peace. It was right here in Paris at the Louvre. And I'm proud to say that today. So in this debate today, we have a really important discussion, a very important role, and this debate is going to be very rich, I'm certain. So I'm going to hand over to Pauline now and to Amélie, who are going to lead us through this debate with partners and participants from a number of regions around the world who are going to help us to understand the scale of the task that is before us. Thank you to everyone who's here, to the 100 or so participants who are here in the room already, and we know that others will also join us throughout the evening. We will be together until 9 o'clock this evening, French time. Over to you, Pauline.
Toutes et à tous, ou bonjour à toutes et à tous, selon vos régions du monde. Et donc,
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. We're going to be talking about a very important issue today, but before then, I would like to talk about a few ideas that have fueled the preparatory exchanges. So firstly, the ICOM Code of Ethics itself, with the museum's mission stated as being acquire, preserve, and promote their collections as a contribution to safeguarding the natural, cultural, and scientific heritage. Inherent in this public trust is the notion of stewardship. Article 2.18 on the protection of the collection states that the museum should establish and apply policies to ensure that its collections are available, and this for current use, and will be passed on to future generations in as good and safe condition as practicable, having regard to current knowledge and resources. According to the recent work of ICOM ETHCOM committee from March 2022, we were reminded of the importance of having database, the form, the material, the provenance, the age, necessary restorations, etc. All documents relating to the objects need to be stored and preserved in the museum. There is therefore a responsibility towards society, a need for professionalism, and a desire for ethics in this work. But what professionals are we talking about? And how do these professionals position themselves at the heart of museums? In preparing for this evening with the panelists, the discussion soon made it clear that the problem we had identified mainly concerned museums with material collections. We can see that the attack or destruction of the materiality of collections and heritage in times of conflict is used as a weapon, because materiality carries meaning. It's a symbol and evidence as identified in the ICOM Code of Ethics. History or personal stories. Heritage and cultural material is destroyed in the same way that we can attack people in the flesh. In normal circumstances, the material ages by itself, and those in charge of collections, i.e. those responsible for studying them, enhancing them, passing them on, etc., seek to understand their nature, techniques, the conditions of aging, the optimal conditions for display and handling. They seek to understand the factors that could accelerate its disappearance and call on people who know it scientifically and physically, experts, professionals who have skills in this area. Article 2.19 of the Code of Ethics refers to collection responsibility and professional responsibilities involving the care of the collections, which should be, and this is a quote, assigned to persons with appropriate knowledge or skill or who are adequately supervised. Some museums manage digital collections or intangible heritage, and one might ask whether they too are not subject to this constraint, since these heritages are also transmitted by means of media or are based on the use of certain tools, raw materials, techniques, and know-how technologies, which are sometimes obsolete. In short, concrete media. Unless one assumes that one does not wish to transmit and conserve these heritages, is there not a responsibility for documentation? While the presence of professionals at the heart of museums is obvious in certain contexts, we will see that in France and elsewhere, there are other types of organizations. So what is the impact of these configurations on the management of collections in terms of temporality, monitoring, teamwork, transdisciplinarity, economy, working conditions, and interprofessional relations? In France, when a central function such as conservation restoration for collections is carried out for the most part outside of museums, this raises the question of how to meet the challenge of being at the service of the collections and the public, or of being part of a sustainable approach. The title of the subject proposed to our partners by ICOM France could have included a question mark to discuss this question about the place of professionals in museums. We have 7 panelists, hopefully, with complementary profiles. So Mr. Luis Raposo, who is an archaeologist by training and president of the ICOM Europe Alliance. And since 2016, he's been president in the Council of Europe and has worked with ICOM. We're going to see his extended vision of the topic. Then there is Susan Kaur, who has been working with the National Gallery in Finland for many years, and she will be giving a personal view as a member of the European Confederation of Conservator Restorers organizations. And we hope that she will be able to give us information about this European. Then there is Olivier Gabet, who is director of the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris. Since 2013, he works in a large Parisian institution with a lot of materials and techniques. Eleanor Kissel, who is head of conservation restoration at the Musée du Quai Branly-Jacques Chirac. She works with extra-European collections where materiality is of special interest. Marie Lopa-Atia is in charge of preventive and curative conservation of collections at the Cité de la Musique Philharmonie de Paris. And she will be talking about how to organize museum collections and the specifics entailed within that. Anne-Laure Rameau is head of collections management at the Palais des Ducs de Lorraine. She works at the shared stock rooms, and it is going to be able to look at the context of closure for renovation. Finally, Darko Babic, who works at the University of Zagreb as vice chair of ICOM's IC for the training of personnel, ICTOP. He will tell us about the importance of training museum personnel within the context of ICTOP. I am now going to go back to Luis Raposo. I think that I saw him in the room earlier, so I would like to ask you a question. So what is your perception on the importance of having professionals at the heart of museums to conserve material collections? Over to you, Luis Raposo. Thank you very much for this invitation and for allowing me to speak today. As you have said, I have worked with museums for 40 years now. The materiality of objects is not necessarily at the heart of my work, but it is a big part of it. I am here today as president of ICOM Europe. I'm not a curator or a conservator, but I would like to give you a more global perspective. I don't know if I can share my own screen or if you prefer to share it for me. Let's start with things as they are. So my presentation is entitled Professionals, Museum Professionals and the Centrality of Collections. The first question that I would like to ask you is very basic. This is a famous quote by Lewis Carroll. If you don't know where you're going, any path will take you there. This is the first slide that I'm presenting you. This is very general. I'm not an expert in conservation and restoration, and I dare to admit this. But this is at the very heart of museums. What is the purpose of museums today? Perhaps you may think that this is a useless question, but I do not think so. As the professionals of museums, we need to be the first to ask ourselves these questions. In all of the media, in so many tools, we've seen museums talked about as places of animation and events, territorial icons, architectural monuments, even if there aren't really collections inside, and this can happen. They are also instruments in order to boost the economy. These are all some of the functions of a museum that we have talked about in the past decades. And they are also, they have other major functions that they have had for centuries. They are places of memory and for communities to come together, and they are means of generating citizenship. The other functions are becoming increasingly important, but these still need to be remembered. Do we need to reinvent museums in line with the contemporary context? This is a question. We have seen this, as Juliette said, within the very definition of museum, with ambiguities and challenges and issues. I'm optimistic. I do believe that we are going to come to a very acceptable conclusion with our definition. But what is at the heart of a museum? Collections. We have seen in recent decades that there are social museums. So we've gone from a relic museum to a social museum, from a social museum to a platform museum. Next slide, please. I believe that in the future years, we're going to see this conception of platform museums developing. This is what GLAM, so galleries, libraries, art galleries and museums. The museum as a component of a tool with variable geometry at the service of community development. This is key, but it is not in the form of a fortress alongside other institutions such as archives. Let me show you the next slide now. I believe that there will be this conception with museums, libraries, social centers, and I think that these institutions may also become part of this, but this does not remove from its central function. It adds to it, especially in small villages or towns where state services are different. There may be a focus on the economy or social centers, for instance. Next slide, please. Given this framework, can museum professionals, are museum professionals covering the needs at the moment? As you know, we have already mentioned this. ICTOP will also refer to this. There is the European Frame of Reference for Museum Professions. In 2008, this was generated, so it is already quite old. This gave us a general conception of museum professions, which was published in France. Here you can see the list of the 2008 professions. So the main, you can see the main different groups of professions on the screen. Since then, we have developed a lot and not necessarily always smoothly. Inside museums, there are a number of professions and professional fields that are a little bit disruptive. Let me take the example of the curator and the director. When we talk about the curator, we see this too much. I think much too often this is associated to curator, commissioner, or even manager. And this has created a real confusion. And I here have included an interview with a woman saying that she was disappointed because she thought that she was going to be learning one thing. She would much prefer to be a curator in the English sense of the word rather than a conservator. This is a universal issue and has major negative consequences for museums and museum professionals. And the same thing is happening with the idea of the museum director. Temporary exhibition directors, these blockbuster exhibitions, were the first to highlight this problem. Instead of knowing the collections, the directors are sought out. They spend time on TV shows with policymakers, etc., instead of with the collections. These changing and misunderstandings between curator and conservator and the new role of directors are major worries for museums nowadays. What about the future? This is a quote from Aristotle. Nature abhors emptiness. And this is true formally or informally. The nature, the classic meaning of curator, conservator is important, and the future might not be the best for museums. These are the permanent fields of activity for museums that we need to, where we need to be thinking about the professionals. But there are new fields of activity. The problem is that these new fields of activity often are the ones supplying museum professionals right across the world, especially in the US, but also in Europe. There are museums that only have these kinds of profiles. Let me give you two examples with the internet. So these are two museum professionals. These are made up names, obviously. And this is their work in the museum. I'm not going to read it out loud. Please read the slide. These are people working in a museum. And when you see that there are museums that almost have exclusively this kind of professional profile, alarm bells ring in my mind. Next slide, please. As well as that, there are the working conditions. Precarious work such as part-time, remote working, outsourcing, franchises. We are building a new world of business as usual, but it's not really business as usual. It's a whole new way of conceiving the organization. And museums inside of that needs professional and relational support and a love of the collections, and this is really suffering. I've almost finished, but finally, and as you have seen, I'm not going to go into details of training, the definition of curator, conservator. That is not my expertise. I'm trying to just establish a general framework. But what is a museum professional nowadays and in the future? 2 years ago, ICOM France already looked at that. This is from 2018. The conclusion of this, I believe, is still very up to date. We talked about a fortress museum perhaps half a century ago. we had a museum perhaps outside of the center, and this is very worrying. I believe that museums working with material collections need to have a focus on those collections. Let me show you this final slide. This is very provocative. I enjoyed reading this book. Even with the book, do museums still need objects? Stephen Kahn's conclusion is that yes, of course, museums are places uniquely situated at the intersection of objects, ideas, and public space. And that is how they need to stay. Collections are absolutely central to museums, even small museums in villages. I'm not even talking about big museums where it seems obvious. Most museums in Europe are small village museums. Even in small village museums where the local lifestyle is emblematic, and perhaps this will also serve as a medicine, a doctor's surgery if there are not other places to go in the village. This is possible, but we should not forget the collections, conservation and restoration of these collectives. Otherwise, over time, this will be a useless place. In Europe, we have had meetings where colleagues have expressed this experience. They accepted having a kind of social project within the museum, but then after a while, it meant that the museum started to die because then people were not able to interact with the collections. Thank you very much for opening this session, showing the changes to profiles and your opinion in that, and what may be obvious for some of us in our community, but there are risks of major changes and losses. So it is important to recall everything that you have just said. In the meantime, our colleague Suzanne Kaur has struggled to connect, but she is fortunate. We are fortunate enough to have her with us now. I'm going to hand over to her now, handing over to her, asking her the same question. On the basis of your experience and your perception, how important is it to you to have the museum professionals at the heart of museums in order to conserve material collections as a museum professional and also as a member of the European cooperation? Over to you.
Pauline, thank you. And I'm sorry if I gave you a fright by not showing up, but I also gave myself a fright. Apologies for being late because I had a car issues trying at a funeral. So I'm very delighted to have been to be here and really fascinated and very interested in hearing what Luis Raposo has to say about objects. Certainly, if there's no objects, do we need conservator restorers? But let me say that the role of the museums and the conservator restorer working in them, yes, is essential, I think, to our understanding of heritage and our understanding of our history and objects as documents, and for many, many reasons. But I'm a conservator, and I've always worked in private practice, although initially I began working in the National Gallery in Ireland and in the Chester Beatty Library. So I was very much on a contract basis with those institutions, especially the Chester Beatty Library in the beginning. And for personal reasons, then I moved away from Dublin, and I've remained a contract conservator. So I have some interesting insights as 10 years working inside an institution and then going to various places. And one of the things I think I would feel very important about is the quality of work. What are we looking for when we talk about heritage and we're talking about museums and the quality of experience, and then the quality of the conservator the work that you expect them to do, and then levels of productivity as against what kind of money you have to spend. And these are issues actually for conservator restorers when they come to find themselves constantly tendering for work, because now everything is about procurement and tendering, and it can be just an exhausting process of then trying to tender for jobs that have to, after a certain amount of money, have to go out, always to tender. And it can affect even a relationship and knowledge and building up knowledge of when you're working privately for institutions, that you have an insight and a profound knowledge of some of the collections. And that's terribly useful. And I think also, if you are working a long time, as I have been, 35 years, attitudes change and things move on, or your approach to things change, and you have no possibility of revising decisions that you might have made. There's no continuity. For the single conservator restorer, that might be okay, but it is interesting. I was just saying in preparing for this talk as well, I'm fortunate enough to be long enough to see younger conservators coming in, and I'm around for them to ask me about work that I did 30 years ago, or procedures that were then accepted, and that maybe you've changed approach, or the level of intervention that is required is different. And that comes down to also working privately, in decision making about what kind of conservation is required, is also now to do very much about public engagement. And I go back, I agree again with Louise, it can't always be about blockbuster exhibitions to engage with the public. Knowledge of collections is hugely important, both for the curator and for the conservator restorer. And the decisions to intervene is actually a decision not only about the object, but for how it's going to be used, where it's going to go. And it can't always be just driven by exhibitions, that objects themselves need conservation or care for many reasons. Yes, to keep them for the long term, but so that they are stable and can be used as a resource into the future for whatever reasons, and that we use these things sustainably and not just because they're in fashion or it's trendy. And I'm always struck as well by, I think it's the Natural History Museum in the UK. They make more money off their coffee and their restaurant than they actually do in people paying to see the museum, which is very interesting to see where the direction of that museum has gone to. But I think the quality of the work that you are looking for is also affected, so it affects conservators too in what they can offer. And there's a role for young conservators then how to price themselves. What are they offering? What service are they offering? And that 80% of conservator restorers work in private practice. And what role the technician then too? A technician can't be simply somebody doing the repeat work all the time. They too need to think about what they are doing. So there's this tension between, well, a conservator restorer, should they just be brought in to cut mounts and to mount all the time? Or is it, is that the work of a technician? So there's even this tension going on between who does what now, what roles are technical and what roles are just repeat, and what role does the conservator restorer make in actually thinking about how policies are made around the care of collections. Fortunately, I have to say, in most of my working career, there's actually a lot of respect amongst colleagues, and that you are invited to participate in short-term decision-making. And maybe that's a question then for museums as well, for the role of museums as a dynamic between, as Luis Raposo said again, between the object, between the public and ideas. And what do the public want? I mean, this is their heritage, this belongs to them too. It is a public good. And how do we work best for the public good? And it is not, I think that this idea of heritage and what it is that what we require of it, what it means to us, we have to really be careful about how we educate and how we educate our children, and how where that falls out in schools, so that that participation begins at an early age, and that interest is stimulated in the knowledge, the real knowledge about processes, about materials, and about the objects and the stories they have to tell. And yes, it worries me when I see museums just being sold as marketing, purely for marketing, for salespeople, and as event managing. When if we don't know what it is that we are managing, we are losing huge insights. And I think the role of the conservator also can offer huge insights into objects. So as a conservator restorer, then, working in private practice, there is an issue about tendering, the possibility to revise your work or to see how how the decisions you take affect where it is now, and how long does conservation, the other question is, how long do we expect conservation to last? I mean, what is a reasonable expectation of care, and when do you revise that care, or what are you expecting of a conservator restorer when you set parameters for a particular piece of work or a particular collection inside a museum? And that old question for money, that it's not just short-termism, that the value for money is actually seen in the long term, and that the right decisions are made. And we're actually speaking about quality again. It comes back to quality, and that hopefully there's also a relationship of trust between colleagues. And that final thing is, while longevity is good too, sometimes we can become also institutionalized in how we think about things, and sometimes it can be hard to shift viewpoints that are just ingrained in particular ways of doing things. And yet the challenges we all face now to do things quickly, to respond fast, to have things done quickly is it's a very difficult one. I don't think it's easy for young conservators coming out now either, finding their way, but I think the care of objects still remains a priority. I think it's hugely important, and that we understand as a paradigmatic of collections and museums, it's really, really important. And it is also something in terms of public participation, which is again what museums are about. When they engage, it's not simply about performing conservation in front of the public. It's about engaging them to understand that they too are responsible for the long-term care. And it's not just simply about blockbuster exhibitions, but that there are these precious collections that we have that really need ongoing consideration as well, in a balanced view. So yes, it's a complicated world out there. Does that help? Does that offer you any insights into my world?
Merci beaucoup Suzanne pour cette présentation. Et on est désolé
Thank you very much, Suzanne, for this presentation.
Je crois qu'on commence un
very
peu
sorry
à
for the
approcher le
problems
cœur du
you had
sujet. On a parlé, grâce à vous,
in
de
getting
qualité,
here.
de préservation à long
You
terme.
jumped right into
Nous vous
exactly what we
proposons
need to be
maintenant
talking about. We're talking about
un focus,
quality.
si vous voulez, comment ça se passe
And now we want to look at actually concretely, how does this actually work on the ground? So I'm going to ask Olivier Gabin now, as director of an institution, how do you see the preservation of collections among the museum's missions? Thank you very much, and good evening to everybody. Thank you for allowing the Museum of Decorative Arts in Paris to speak through me today, and it's an opportunity for me to share my point of view as well as a director. When I hear what we've just heard, and when I review that quote from Louis of Gaskell, I have that impression that perhaps maybe I'm in a hyper-privileged bubble, or or perhaps I should come at it from such a caricature approach. I think it's not really worth thinking about blockbusters on one side and collections on the other. I think that kind of antagonism doesn't really help, and it's not really very relevant, actually. I think as a director of a museum that was founded 150 years ago and is now on Rue de Rivoli in Paris, and is a decorative arts museum, like many other decorative arts museums around Europe and the world, has a wide range of collections. And this museum wasn't set up by a president or by a king, but by a committee and a community of industrialists and art lovers. So it is a museum of collection. And I want to say that since this museum is focused on the world, it's a museum linked into creative industries, fashion, craft, graphic arts, with a very specific focus on heritage and historical collections. There is a kind of balance point of what many museums are today, where it's a kind of meeting point of a number of different museums. We are a museum that brings people together, as you can see here on the slide, under the Ministry of Culture. That's where its budget comes from, but it has responsibility for national collections. It is in a national public building, but a lot of its activity is linked to collections, comes through patronage. So I don't know if our museum is like representing a kind of third way, but that is what we're trying to do together with our curators and conservators restorers. And our conservators restorers are really at the heart of our museum plan, of what we do in our museum. And I'm trying to work with all these different teams, because when you're in a medium-sized museum like ours, with a fairly small budget, we live with our teams and we work with our teams. I'm not stuck off in an office somewhere. What I really wanted to talk about today is perhaps an example I just wanted to share here, because I have been in the museum since September 2013, since we recruited Florence Bertin as manager of the collection department. We've tried to show that there's a way of changing the model, and that a museum like ours, with a whole range of different collections, if we have a team that's beyond a conservation team, but a team that is completely dedicated to collections, this is something that's really important. So if we look at the next slide, in 2014, we created a single department that brings together everything linked to the physical and legal life of the works. I think this is really important. This doesn't take away the responsibility of curators, because they have a really key role to play. So we have an acquisitions department, a works registrar department, and a conservation restoration department, all mixed in together under this overall department. And I think what interests us today and what we're focusing on today in this event is, as you can see here, the collections department under Florence Bertin. We have something like 1 million works listed in our inventory, and we have a dedicated team. We weren't doing this because it was a trend. Susan was talking about what a museum is, the tension between what a museum is and what happens today as the trend. When I arrived here, there was a bit of a trend actually to externalizing work because we just thought we had to have a single person to coordinate external contractors. But actually, I felt we needed another model when I came here. And I want to say we need to have a bit of hope, and I want to speak with a bit of hope. I don't want to present too much of a caricature, but I think that when we have a board with some of the members are important, have figures, important personalities in the life of the museum, and they also contribute to funding. What's important is to talk with these people with arguments that they understand, and not to be pretentious or a bit arrogant. And I would really like to honor the president at the time when I arrived of the Decorative Arts Board, the chair of this board at that time. And I explained to him that if we had teams totally focused and dedicated on collections, was an amazing opportunity for the museum, especially a museum like ours, a decorative arts museum. And I am not worried too much like Luis about marketing and all that. Yeah, there are this kind of activity goes on, but I think actually when we use some of these words like marketing and things, we can perhaps reach other people. But I think what I was trying to say, and I was trying to say to my chair of the board at that time, this is not only good for the collections, but actually having a dedicated team in this way is both productive and profitable. It's a bit scandalous to say those words. Those are sort of shocking words, because if we use those words with people coming from the private sector, they understand those words. And when we say to them, we want to recruit teams that are devoted to the collections so that we don't end up spending a lot of money so that we're just spreading it out, but so that we're effective and focused on these collections. But I am proud of the collective work that we've done, and we can look at the next slide. 8 years later, we have 8 conservator restorers. We have 10 or 11 curators, 8 conservators. So there's a good proportion here, and they work on textiles, on fashion, and as Suzanne was saying, this fundamental work that they do on collections with private patronage as well. We have a foundation in New York that has been able to contribute $1 million over a number of years in order to be able to restore fashion collections. We can see that this is something that's really important. And then this is done by our eternal teams who, within the museum, who work with these works. And there is an exhibition coming up, which I hope is going to be a blockbuster exhibition, but is linked to these restored works and the work of our conservators. We have new workshops, nearly 100 meters squared of workshops within the museum itself. This is really colossal. It's sort of underground at the museum, and this has been funded by the profits made in 2018, 2019 through a campaign that we carried out then, and this funding has been targeted on to the development of these workshops, and it's seen as a kind of investment for the future. When we talk about acquisition, we're coming into a period where there's a particular relationship with museums. I think, given what we've just experienced, of course, I am seeing people come back to museums. There's a need to connect with collections after the isolation that we've had. But I think when we can say to our patrons that what we're doing is for the development of the museum, these are investments for the future with regard to our collections. Maybe I'm a bit naive and a bit optimistic, but up till now, these are messages that have been heard. And the fact that we have this team of conservators and we have these workshops, we've been able to recruit 2 or 3 temporary employees every year. We have about 35 interns working in restoration, working in the registrar's office. And I think that's a very important role that they have. And we have 2 or 3 school projects every year. And Charles Personnaz with the INP is really doing a crucial work on these questions. If we think about really moving against the separation of training and the places in which we work, and then we have about 60 external conservators also who are working with us within our institution, and we need support from these external conservators. So that means that within our institution, the fact that we have this in-house team is really fundamental because it focuses the collections in on what the heart of the museum is all about. This might not be very politically correct if I'm saying that. Saying this, I work with external conservators. I've got no problem with that. But I think when we show that collections are important for the museum and that we're ready to invest in these collections, ready to have patrons of these collections, the question of collections becomes central again. So yes, I'm defending the model that we've put in place with our museum teams, but I think this is a model that helps to raise awareness and understanding of museums, because what we can see with the people we talk about, with the patrons, journalists, members of our board, when we're talking with them, when we can say that within the museum itself, you can see this work on collections, you can see this restoration work taking place. And I think it's something that's important for us to have as well, these conservators within our team. They are part of our museum teams. They're just as important as the registrars. They are just as important as the other teams, as communication teams, as marketing teams. I won't go over this list that's in front of you because it's a bit banal perhaps, but just to share the figures, we restore about 200 graphic works every year. We have several hundreds of thousands of these, so it's a fairly modest figure, but it's an important fundamental work. And then thanks to private patronage, we've had 20 to 30 fashion garments, 80 to 100 metallic works, 20 to 30 wood furniture pieces that we're handling every year. There's also been this disinfestation projects for removing insects and different types of infestation, and we also need to think about the mannequins, and we do about 300 to 500 of these every year, which is important when we're thinking about acquisition. And I think these are remarkable figures. So perhaps if I just go even more quickly over this, because I think I'm running out of time, but in terms of presenting what the restoration work that we do, there is, we tried to show this as part of our exhibitions. If we can go on to the next slide. Of course, there's important jobs in terms of checking lighting, of anoxia treatments to deal with insects, and then questions around mannequins, as I've mentioned. Perhaps we could go on terms of the slides, so you can see the different restoration works that we're involved with here. This is, I'm presenting perhaps 8 or 9 years of development and consideration of these subjects. I think the fact that we have nearly 800 meters squared of workshops is really good. So the exhibition galleries are about 6,000 meters squared. So there's a good ratio here in terms of the workshops that we have. And all of this means that today we're able to put our collections back at the center of our museum, although externally in the media, our museum might be seen as a museum that does blockbuster exhibitions, temporary exhibitions, but actually I think we need to not just think about the external appearance of things, we need to open the book and not just judge it by its cover. We're all about restoring and conserving collections. That's what I wanted to share with you really this evening.
Ah oui, belle photo.
Thank you very much. Those were some beautiful photos. Thank you very much, Olivier Gabet, for sharing this general information from the point of view of a director. We're now going to move on to the two conservator restorers who we've invited to share their experiences, Eleonore Kissel and Marie-Anne Lepère Attia. I think that there was a question in the chat for Mr. Gabet. I don't know. I think I might wait for Eleanor and Marianne's presentation, as it is a question that relates to the outsourcing alongside in-house conservators, restorers. But I think I've understood that, Mr. Gabet, you're not going to be with us until the very end. Yes, I am sorry. I do have other obligations afterwards. I did see a question. We do agree that there is a constant question about the relationships between the interns, conservators, restorers. When you're on collections that are over hundreds of thousands of pieces, from the antiquity through to future paper, metal, porcelain, ceramics, etc. I think there are museums that cover all of these, and I think decorative art museums will have understood the immense scope. That means that outsourced work is for resources that we do not have in-house, or very one-off issues, or perhaps they come in to support room in reopenings, for instance. And with regard to our interns, this is work with a number of different schools and training centers. These are not people that are replacing in-house positions. They support teams across the museum. I think I am one of the few people that managed to get through the School of Heritage without doing an internship. I was always very skeptical in about the internship model within the French training system. I felt that it was perhaps not very useful, but actually the interns that we have are never there to replace positions. They're often for quite short periods of time, and they are here to learn and to supplement their academic learning. I know that Florence Bertin is here in the room. I saw a question about the recruitment criteria. I am not in the recruitment jury for conservator restorers in-house. So if Florence would like to reply to that quickly, there are criteria related to speciality, of course, specialism, and we need a lot with textiles as well. This is a fundamental field for the museum. We have some real remarkable individuals working on fundamental research in textiles. We recruit individuals on the basis of various criteria. Perhaps Florence could add to what I have said. I've only been able to give you a general overview, but I do believe that our recruitment is strategic for the museum. I don't want to take much time. I do apologize, Pauline. Good evening, everybody. We work on the basis of the CV, on their skills and on their experience. It's not especially specific. Okay, that reassures me, says Olivier. Thank you. Amélie, thank you very much, Florence, for this precision. I'm now going to hand over to Eleanor Kiesel, who will be presenting the departments at a museum. Where is Eleanor? We cannot hear you.
Et Léonore, j'ai l'impression que ton micro est coupé.
Eleanor, your microphone is not working. Can you hear me now? Yes. I do apologize. I will be presenting the situation at the Musée du Quai Branly, which has exceptional collections in terms of their volume. There aren't the millions of items in the Museum of Decorative Arts, but we have 8,000 photos, several thousand items and objects, and we are responsible for preserving these. These are unique collections due to the diversity from all geographical periods, from the antiquity to the present day, and also through the diversity of materials. The collection comes from all ecosystems across the planet. They're also highly complex collections due to the questions that they raise, and I will be sharing some of those with you this evening. The responsibility for their conservation is managed by an in-house team of 4 conservators, restorers, and 1 registrar, and then 1 manager. So our main role is to monitor these collections, working on the environment. You can see an example here of what we can do in terms of the climate control. So we're monitoring and also checking and taking care of the collections. Here you can see work carried out on around 1,000 objects in our permanent collection. This was carried out in-house jointly by the Registrar Office and the Conservator Office, with a number of other service providers that are all qualified conservator restorers. Here you can see a Kanak mask. On the left-hand side, you can see a member of our in-house team at the time and another who is still with us. On the right, there is Alexandra, who is conservator restorer, specialized in graphic arts. I work very closely with 100 service providers. Some work just a few days a year for the museum, and others have longer assignments that can reach several weeks in the year. So our questions in terms of conservation and restoration are shared with the collection managers. You can see on the left-hand side, this is an object, a magical object, traditionally, and it has issues with corrosion, and also ethically, we need to respect the use and the meaning behind these objects when presenting them to the public in order to present them in an intelligent way with both the materials and the meaning. Beyond conservation and restoration, we have a function of protection. And here you can see the packaging work that has been carried out by an in-house conservator restorer specialized in textiles. These are pre-Columbian counting systems, and here this is a little bit more technically complex and unique. This is a conservator restorer who created a preventive system. This is anoxic packaging where oxygen is extracted through the absorber packs that you can see. And these were co-designed internally and externally and implemented by a specialist service provider. Accidents do happen even in the best museums, and on the left-hand side, you can see flooding on some photographs, and Stephanie was responsible for restoration. She came at 3 a.m. on the 15th of August, a bank holiday in France, in order to manage these photographs and has taken them into the studio and restored them as quickly as possible. Conservation restoration teams work with the collection managers in order to identify the state and make observations, and they also try and characterize the materials of our very diverse objects at the Musée du Quai Branly. They work in partnership with the curators and scientific and conservation teams, working with public laboratories and also with private companies. Here we needed to identify different kinds of ivory, and you can see 3 types of ivory represented on the screen. Depending on the needs that we have for analysis, we either carry this out in-house or we work with other public or private laboratories. This study of collections is also collaborative. Here you can see a video consultation carried out in December 2020 with a visit of a North American delegation from a tribe, and you can see a small webcam here with a consultation that lasted 3 hours. And here you can see our head of heritage, an independent researcher, and a specialized legal advisor for the intellectual property of indigenous peoples, and then myself as well. On the top left, these are very frequently used for collaborative work. We also have a role in sharing and transmitting. We don't just want to keep our collections in storerooms, we want to show them to the public. Although it is beautiful, this is the Canat exhibition here. And you can see a beautiful presentation. But we also need to work with the installers, the case designers, and the conservation restoration team. With this kind of object, for instance, from Iran, we had to work very carefully, but then there's also an intangible side of the exhibition that the curators are working on. And we will base our work on this in order to determine the kind of processing that we carry out, or the positioning of the object, or what kind of case we produce. So this is all part of our ethical and sustainable management. In 2015, we carried out a pesticide campaign. Here you can see Marie Lebou, who's working with Fabrice Soubeniac, who is responsible for conservation, in order to carry out microchemical tests in order to determine whether there is arsenic or mercury, traces of other heavy metals or pesticides that could be problematic for the health of all individuals working with these collections. Sustainable management of the collections as well has been shown through numerous ways. We do not want to wear out our collections. Here you can see the discoloring charts that I carried out myself in order to establish the maximum exhibition time before color modifications start to occur. In terms of ethical and sustainable development, this approach also seeks to conserve culturally sensitive objects. At the Musée du Quai Branly, we specialize in this, so there are sometimes sacred objects. So you can see in the object at the left, there is a real question about some of the components in this mannequin. And here you can see some extra European graphics, but there's a real Euro, and I do recognize the Eurocentric term that I'm using, but we have worked long and hard for a Cameroon exhibition currently presented in the Galerie Jardin. We were looking at what is forbidden, what is invisible in these objects, in dialogue with the producing communities. And this is one of the unique features of our activities at the Conservation and Restoration Hub. I would like to finish up by saying that I am really lucky to work in an institution where I can trust the in-house team, where we work together to ensure quality control of the material conservation of these collections. I do agree with Susan that it is very important to take a step back with regard to our collections. And this is only possible if some of the team is in-house. I think you've understood that we have a team of professionals, including 4 conservator restorers in-house. This helps us to work with the source communities as well. Our aim is to work in service of the public today and the public of tomorrow as well. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much, Eleanor. I would now suggest that we move on to another type of collection, handing over to Marianne, who is a restorer conservator. So this is Marianne Loperatia. So first of all, I'm going to give you a quick introduction of the institution before sharing some of my skills. The Philharmonie is part of the CRC, the Center of Research for Conservation. CRC has three teams. First of all, there is MNHN, sorry, the Natural History Museum, ECR, the Conservation Research Team, and the LRMH, the laboratory. There are 86 people, so we're able to pool equipment and skills. We have around 50 technical analysis devices available with X-ray imaging capacities, like you can see on the right. Next slide, please. The CRC in the museum works with humanities, physical sciences for the conservation and restoration of musical instruments. We work in our own campus and on the campus of other institutions, particularly music museums. The Philharmonie de Paris have concert halls, a library, and exhibitions. We have around 6,000 works, including instruments, but also fine arts and a lot of archives. The research activity works in material and cultural history. So it's an artistic object, a technical object, and it also vehicles the vehicle of a musical function and an artistic function. We work with this is quite similar to what can happen in other artistic or technical museums. If we can look at the next slide now, I would like to show you the composition of the ECR. There's Marie-Pauline Martin, who's the director. There are 4 curators, 4 conservator restorers, the laboratory manager, who's also a conservator restorer. There's a documentation team as well that's part of our research. We have PhD and we have a number of registrars and interns from the conservation restoration master program, or we also have engineering, chemistry and physics interns. Next slide, please. What are our skills? So here in the middle, I've shown you this beautiful piano by Johannes Couchet that was redecorated in France in 1701. This object has had a number of campaigns. This is one of the museum's activities. This is a harpsichord. 2% of the instruments are already able to be played, but that is it. But it is a very difficult issue for us to achieve. So to make it possible to play this instrument, we had to carry out preliminary activities, including static, dynamic analysis, acoustic analysis, in order to understand whether this instrument could even become playable. The curator, the conservator restorer, and a scientist were able to work on this and validate interventions on the object. We were then able to play this instrument. The curator is involved in this, the musicians, and also the registrar and the conservator, in order to monitor the instrument, to clean the instrument, to stretch out the chords, etc. An instrument is examined and is studied. Many of our instruments have been subject to this kind of campaign. Some were studied to create facsimiles, which you can see on the bottom left. This is a technique where the curator, conservator, restorer, and the player of the instrument or the manufacturer comes to identify what they can do to create a facsimile of the instrument in part or in whole. And they're able to work on the conservation restoration in order to display this product to the public, and preventive conservation interventions, etc. The final slide now. If we look at the conservator restorer, what are their actions within the museum? I've summed them up here on the slide. There are interventions on the collection. Internally, we work on around half of the instruments. The other half are with external restorers, as we do not have the necessary skills in-house. We also have X-ray machines, but we do not have all specialists in-house. We have textiles, we have paintings, we have a lot. So we outsource to independent conservators, restorers that we select on the basis of their skills and their CVs. We have a large variety of operators. We also monitor works for temporary exhibitions before and after. There's a link with the temporary exhibition department in the museum. We help to draft proposals to make sure that the work will never be in danger. We choose the exhibition casing, for instance, the climate, insects, control, and all of the scenography for temporary exhibitions. We work alongside scientists for analysis. We make sure that the work is not in danger, which is why we need an analysis, and we work with the curator to see how we can make the most of this analysis for the object. We assess the state of the object and whether it is possible to make it playable. And we also think about the protocols. An instrument that can be played requires maintenance, and this is a long-term task. We need to update maintenance protocols so that we can have correct conservation protocols before and after it is played, as this is highly difficult moments in the object's lives. So the link with musicians before and after it's been played, how we can support and limit the risks on everything that the instrument may be subject to in the museum. There's also sharing knowledge, and I would like to focus on this now. We work with schools, music schools, and also conservation schools in order to raise awareness. People working in science and climate control, we want to raise awareness of specific issues in museums. This helps enrich our discourse in-house. In each case, this gives us the ability to create multidisciplinary teams so that we can respond to all of the questions we have. This is only possible with an in-house team working every day to build bridges between those coming in every day for specific issues or those monitoring for short, mid, and long-term protection and prevention around the objects. I think that's everything that I wanted to say about what we do in the museum. And like Eleanor, I'm so lucky to work in this kind of institution because I believe that the objects are better
Merci beaucoup,
preserved.
Marianne, pour cette présentation
Thank you very
où on
much,
retrouve
Marianne, for this
des résonances avec
presentation.
celle d'Éléonore sur
Connection
l'ensemble des
here with
missions
what we've
qui
heard
sont
from Eleanor
mises en œuvre dès lors
all
qu'on
the
s'intéresse à la
different
préservation matérielle
missions
des
that have
collections. Et
rolled
je
out
voudrais donc à
in your
présent donner la
institution when we're
parole à
focused in
Anne-Laure
on
Rameau.
collections. So
Donc on sait qu'en
I would
France,
like to hand
la
over
présence
now
de
to
conservateurs-restaurateurs au
Anne-Laure
sein des établissements
Rameau,
culturels
We know
n'est pas la
that
règle.
in France,
Nous avons donc
there
invité
are
le musée Lorrain
different
de
ways of
Nancy à nous
handling
présenter son
things. So we
fonctionnement,
wanted
sa
to
manière
invite
de
Anne-Laure
répondre aux
Rameau to
besoins
come on behalf of
de
the
cette
Musée
conservation
Lorrain
matérielle des œuvres. Donc Anne-Laure
to
Rameau,
just talk
vous
about
êtes
how they
régisseuse.
handle
Est-ce que
things.
vous pouvez donc nous indiquer
Anne-Laure
comment le musée
Rameau,
Lorrain fonctionne
you
et
are
également
a
comment en tant que
registrar. Could you talk
régisseur,
to
vous
us about
concevez
how
votre
your
rôle dans la
museum
préservation des collections? Et je
functions?
crois
And
qu'un des points
also, as a
communs des
registrar, I
présentations
think you
d'Éléonore et de Marianne, c'est de
preserve
bien
your
montrer cette
role in
articulation.
handling
Donc
collections. And I
c'est
think what's
une
interesting
soirée
here
sur les
between
professionnels
what
dans les musées,
you're going
et
to
c'est
share and what
aussi
we've
une
heard
façon
from
de montrer
Marianne is
comment
that
les
there's a
missions
coordination between
s'articulent
your
entre les différentes
role,
compétences qu'on peut trouver
your
dans les
job,
musées.
and that of
Alors, je vais partager
conservators. I think
mon
it's
écran,
something very
voir si
interesting.
ça fonctionne correctement. Alors là, j'ai mis la première diapo. Est-ce que vous la voyez correctement?
So here's my first slide.
Donc,
Can you
déjà,
see that
merci
properly?
d'avoir convié le musée Lorrain à cette soirée débat. On sera un
So
petit peu sur
thank
l'ensemble
you, first of
de
all,
petits
for the
pousser
invitation
avec moi
to
et les équipes en
this
fait, des musées qui ont
debate
été présentées
today.
juste avant.
I think
Donc,
we're
Amélie l'a dit,
perhaps
donc, je suis
a
responsable
small
de la
museum
relation
compared
des
with some of the others
collections
that have
au
been presented.
musée Lorrain de Nancy, qui est un musée municipal. Je vais aussi du coup porter la parole des régisseurs.
I
On a vu beaucoup de restaurateurs
am
ou de
speaking
conservateurs
here
ici.
on behalf of
Un des métiers qu'on a cité, qui fait
restorers,
partie de l'écosystème de la préservation des collections. Je vais
and
présenter
I'm
hyper rapidement le musée, mais je pense
just
qu'il est
wanting to
bien
present
moins connu que le musée des
as
Arts Déco et
best
que
as
le
I
musée du
can
patrimoine. Donc,
our
on est un
museum
musée
here. I
qui a
think
été
we're
créé
perhaps
il y a
less well
quelques années
known.
même par une société savante.
We were
On
founded
produit
by
un
a
ensemble de bâtiments
society of knowledge in the 19th
à proximité
century,
immédiate
and
du
we're
28e classé
very
patrimoine mondial. Donc, je ne sais pas si
close
vous voyez
to
mon
a
pointeur, mais on a un ensemble avec le Palais Ducal.
classified site. You
Les
can
unités
see
de
the
logement des
Palais
employés
Ducal
qui doivent
here,
accéder à ce petit bâtiment, le bâtiment fond de cour, la petite écurie,
and
la petite carrière qui
you
sont
can
disposés,
see here
et
the
le
way
hall
the
de
buildings are
rassemblement
built around the
qui
courtyard
prépare
here with
le
the
musée, qui est peut-être un peu
small
plus récent, mais il y a
quarry,
quelques mois.
the
Et puis nous avons une
government
deuxième
palace, and we
unité
also have an
permanente
external
ici au Grand
reserve
Nancy,
here.
le musée de la métropole du Grand Nancy. Donc on est 5 musées. Le
There
musée
are
Lorrain est fermé
5
aux travaux.
different museums
Il y a
all
que les
working
documents
together here. Our
d'entretien
museum is currently
publics, et on a donc
shut
deux
for
numéros de transfert
renovation
de documents. J'en
work,
parlerai
so
à
I'll
la fin de mon intervention.
talk to you
Donc
about
nous avons,
this
là je
later,
vous ai mis une petite vue
but here's
d'architecture
a
à quoi ressemblera le musée quand il sera
architectural view of what the museum will look like when it's reopened again. So we have a collection that's a lot smaller than what we've heard previously, 155,000 objects.
On est un musée d'histoire et de société qui couvre
We are a
quasiment toutes les
history and
typologies
society museum
de
which covers
l'art
all
de l'art déco, vraiment de la
types
préhistoire jusqu'au
of
XXe
work,
siècle. Dans les
and
en propre, c'est-à-dire au sein
we have
du
works up
musée
to the
Lorrain,
20th
on
century.
a des équipes de
Within our
conservateurs, ce qui
team,
est
we have
vraiment
3
super.
conservators,
Une personne en charge
which
des
is
projets de rénovation et puis
excellent.
3
We
personnes en charge
have
de
someone
conservation, 5 personnes en
responsible
charge de
for
sécurité sûreté. Bon, je vous rappelle que le musée
conservation and
Lorrain est un musée
restoration, someone else
et que
working
la
on
partie et bâtiment, parce que comme beaucoup comme
security,
moi,
and then also a
on a
department
mêlé les deux, donc on est 5 personnes. En fait,
for
c'est 4 personnes
the
responsables
registry
de
of the
collection
collections
bâtiment.
and the
On a
buildings. These
travaillé
people are
sur
working
les services
together,
mutualisés
and we have
des
pooled
spécialisés dans la
services
pour les services
between
mutualisés
our
dédiés
3
à la
museums in terms of
communication et commercialisation.
communication and
La mission
administration,
de la
etc.
régie au sein du
In
musée,
terms
c'est
of the
pareil,
role
on est
of
classé
the
donc
registrar's
dans le
office
service de
for the
gestion des
collections,
collections.
it's
Donc
a fairly
tout ce qui est gestion du
standard
matériel en fait
role.
de
We're focused
collection.
on
Les
material
services,
management of the
donc un
collections.
responsable, moi-même, un
The
régisseur
department
et
has
deux
a
architectes.
manager, the
Une
registrar,
carte de
myself,
préservation du
and
musée qui
2
n'est pas
technicians.
encore totalement bien définie, qu'on peut
And
aussi appeler
these
installateur
roles are not
d'œuvre,
yet
assistant
fully
d'expérience. On a
defined.
vu qu'en même temps, au musée
The
Lorrain, on était
technicians,
un
these
peu
could be
dans
called
l'aspect bâtiment
installers, or
et œuvre. Et on a depuis
we need to
quelques
define
années
better
travaillé
their
sur
role.
des
We've had
spécialisés,
some people
des
focused
techniciens
particularly on
spécialisés.
works
Nous
in the
travaillons
past,
que
but
sur des
now
artistes
we
spécialisés
just have
pour
2
cela,
registrar
pour le ménage,
technicians who work
le nettoyage, le
on the
nettoyage,
works,
l'installation
um,
dans
removing dust,
nos différents
packaging,
sont voilà, très
transport,
techniques en
installation,
gestion de
etc. So
conservation physique,
our
gestion de
roles and our
collection
missions are
et
fairly
gestion
standard,
des
everything to
collections.
do with
Dans le
conservation,
cadre
risk
des
management, and the movement of
professionnels, on peut
collections.
lisser un petit
In
peu
terms of the
la variété
professionals
des métiers
that
avec
are
lesquels
involved
on
in our
collabore en
work,
tant que régisseur, et ce qui fait d'ailleurs pour
um,
moi la richesse de ce pôle-là.
this is
Donc
one
des
of the
conservateurs chargés de collection, des
excellent
chercheurs ou des
things we
enseignants,
have.
mais
We
également
have
des photographes, des services
conservators who are responsible for research, and then we have technical services responsible also for managing the buildings, because of course, protecting the buildings is the first way to conserve works. We work with those involved in prevention, specialist transporters, and also heritage engineering companies, as I've called them here, towards the bottom right of that slide. I'm also going to talk about conservation and movement, because we need to think about, in terms of physical conservation, preventive conservation, and curative conservation are, of course, managed only by accredited conservators, as the French museum regulations require. But in terms of prevention, there is an involvement of a varied grouping of skills and expertise. Sometimes we draw in prevention specialists, sometimes conservators. So here's an example, dust removal. So we do this initial preventive work with our internal teams. So you've got a registrar technician here who's removing dust from this work. They have been trained by the conservators on jobs that they have done with the conservators, restorers. And then there are some works and some parts of works that we don't remove dust from ourselves. So on this particular work, on works like this, we, for example, won't work on gilt in-house, and then the picture layers as well will always be done by a specialist conservator restorer. So we prepare works for exhibitions, and we do this before putting them on exhibition or before sending them out on loan. These are all things that the registrar's office handles. There is also the preparation of works for future presentation within permanent exhibitions, which is handled by a colleague, Frédéric Gauja, who is responsible for this whole area, because all of the restoration work is done by conservators. But in terms of the planning of restoration and renovation, we have worked with specialist restorers on a number of occasions, because we see that a standard registrar's observation would not have been sufficient to see what the damage was, to see what needed to be done in terms of restoration. So we have a fairly high number of works for us. We've already had 600 works restored, but we've got another 400 that still need to be done. In terms of tools, we've been asked to put all of our needs for the three municipal museums that we are working with to do a single public procurement contract. And we managed to find a format that made it possible to issue purchase orders for simple tasks, as it were, and that could be done more quickly, but then a more consistent, a bigger, more complex system for works that need more complex and more careful handling. We think about working as well with transporters and people involved in mounting. We have perhaps a polyvalent expertise within the museum. We have been trained through reading, of course, but also there's training from the INP. There's a lot of technical registry training programs on offer with the INP, the French Heritage Institute. And so we get support from some technicians, but when there's, for example, a fragile paper or this kind of thing, we have specialist help, or for other complex approaches, we have the same approach with packaging. We do a lot ourselves, but there are some times when we are using materials that we can't handle. For example, when we have to have a lot of packaging in a short period, there's only 4 of us and we need a bigger team. So we call on specialist transporters at that point. But, for example, we work with some metals, but we can't work with all metals. Very quickly, I talked about transfer of collections just to show you how this works, who does it, and when. For restorers, as with all kinds of transfers, we have a number of restrictions and requirements. And one of these restrictions is, of course, the nature of the works, which meant that we had to do specific operations. And so we considered their level of fragility, whether they had been infested or were subject to mold, questions of guilt, etc., gilt work, gilding, and whether they needed to be removed from their stands, and whether we needed specialist transport help. So we had developed 3 types of objects that we could handle ourselves, small or medium sized, which we could handle without special vehicles, and then and these were generally our ceramic, glass, and metal types. Type 2 were types that needed to be reviewed by restorers or specialist transporters. So these are maybe medium-sized or big objects that needed to be reviewed for infestation, for coloring issues, of course. And then the third but unusual case is mounted pieces that need to be demounted. And so this particular job was that's cited here in the picture was carried out with a specialist archaeologist, and then the carpeting was handled by another specialist here for transport. Some of the objects we did with interns who were involved in learning and being trained how to package these objects. And then we didn't really know about this particular these particular types of objects, so we had an in-depth study carried out for these. The previous projects we we managed to do this ourselves. Here at the end, here is another example which was prepared by the restorers. 19 of these were carried out by transporters and 80 of them were handled by the registrar's office. A number of these were carried out of ourselves. Here's another project where there was a demounting, removal, where we needed specialist teams, stoneworking teams who had to come and help us here. We had objects that we had to take down, but we were able to do ourselves, of small glass work. There was also here we asked for a photo restorer to work on this particular project, and then in terms of there's a transport work here where they needed specialist help themselves for carrying this particular piece. There you go. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anne-Laure, for this last presentation, an example of work within French museums. And these examples in France are showing the need to have in-house teams in particular so that we can handle the varied range of collections. You talked as well about the risks of moving objects. So thank you very much for all of these examples, which really show that at a French level what's going on. And it's excellent to see these examples of of having conservators as part of integrated in-house teams. I've seen in the chat that the Modern Art Museum, the National Modern Art Museum, has in-house conservator teams. That's an excellent thing. But now I want to look internationally again, and I'm going to ask Mr. Darko Babic to speak. We've got some examples here because he is vice president of the International Committee for the Training of Personnel. Darko, could you talk to us a bit about this work that you do and the responsibility of museums in terms of the protection of collections?
Yeah, thank you, Pauline. Is the sound okay? Yeah, okay. So I'm very happy for the invitation and happy to share what actually is the role of ICTOP in a sense of training of personnel, training, different kind of the training around the globe. Next slide, please. So basically, the ICTOP is one of 30 plus international committees of ICOM with a headquarters in Paris, like all others. And our main mission, as we see it, is to encourage and promote training programs at, as we are saying, all levels and in all or any region around the world. Why I'm saying this? Because, of course, as you are well aware, situations are not the same in Europe or some part of Africa, or even within Europe, the situation is not the same. And of course, the scale of museum, which I go back later on in my presentation. So what we do, we support training programs at university level, as well as different training programs as a part of lifelong education and professional development. No matter do we do that by invitation on or our own cooperation with the local museum or heritage association, institution, or anybody else who actually is involved in training connected with museum and the museum profession. We tend to develop professional standards, which will prepare, we hope, future museum heritage workers for a future institutional changes. So those we experience today or those we predict could be something important in the future. Of course, the main idea is that we support idea education, and training is the precondition of a good practice and professional direction for our entire sector. So the next one, please. To try to show you the overview. So what we do, the annual meeting done by many other international committee too, but just the list here illustrate that our intention to be really around the globe. So Vietnam, Barbados, Italy, Namibia, New Zealand, Japan, pandemic 2 years, and then this year Czech Republic with as a part of triennial. And if you look at the beside annual meetings, if you look at the workshop and seminars we've done, again, Fiji, Turkey, France, Iran, Malaysia. And beside that, if you look quickly, that was all of them in 2018, which was a very productive year, I must say. And if you look at the topics, again, there is education, then communication, then the workshop which Luis already mentioned, that one in Paris, organized by ICOM France, about who is museum professional today, then cooperation with ICOFOM as a part of joint session in Iran, and then cooperation with Asian European Museum Network, working on collection management and care in Malaysia for those people coming mostly from Southeast Asia. Again, different location, different situation. And we always, when we are doing that, it's not always our initiative. When we are doing that, we always trying to, of course, being in communication with the local partners, asking that what is their need, because no point to go somewhere and deliver what we think supposed to be delivered there, but we need to know what is the need in the region, and those needs are really different. So in some cases, you know, collection management and care as a main topic, not in sense of what we're discussing now. Better to use another example. communication, for example, could be something which is focused in some part of the world. And for some other parts, they already done quite a lot on that. So this is not maybe their priority. Next one, please. So this is just illustration of that one done joint session with ICOFAM in Iran, and the one down there, the session, the class or workshop done in Malaysia. Next one, just as illustration. As an extra, we are cooperating in different kind of the projects. Could be, you know, European, could be outside Europe, could be national, so to say, or ICOM special projects. So again, as example, we participated in heritage interpretation for adult learning project from 2013 to 2016. I will show the brochure later on. Then the cooperation with colleagues from Armenia, special project about issues in post-Soviet countries, then about access and inclusion in Southeast Asia. Then, for example, the museum professional work in higher education, including especially university museums, which are, again, have some specifics. Again, museum education, training of trainees, so cooperation with foremost ICOM CC as a leader, in a sense of to train leaders in conservation risk assessment, which is going on. Cooperation this year with colleagues from Italy in sense of emerging skills for heritage conservation in general. So that one really addressing what we are discussing here. And we are associated partner in Chartered Alliance, which I'm guessing it will be mentioned later on. All in all, we try to advise in sense of professional development regarding the curriculum, case studies of professional staff training, guidance of job, human resource, so any kind which is connected with training of and professional development of museum experts. Next one, please. So this is two, and the next slide will show another two. Recent publication, well, three of them are recent. One is, as Luis mentioned, one from 2008, but go back, Pauline, please. Pauline, please go back. Thanks. Thank you. So the one is communication-oriented museum, which is ebook done in 2020. And of course, it's discussing communication. Why I'm showing these four, because all of them you can download from ICTOP website. So they are free to download. If you go to ICTOP website to resources, you can download all of them. The next one is access and inclusion in South and Southeast Asian Museum, workshop done as a part of the special project in late 2019. Publication came out in 2020. Now, please, the next one. The one right on the right side of the slide is the manual professional development in heritage interpretation done as that EU project I mentioned before. Again, free to download and to use it if you find in some sense interesting. And then I'm coming or going back to that museum profession or European frame of reference, which Luis Raposo mentioned at the beginning, which was actually done in 2008, so quite old in a sense, but still relevant. Of course, if you look for any kind of the digital part or digital position, you will not find that inside that frame of reference. But everything else, I think it's still pretty valid. Of course, it needs the update, but as a part of that booklet, you can check, even find general answers to some of questions we had, we saw in a chat. And that include, for example, you know, for different kind of position in museum, what is the basic standard for education? What kind of education someone needs to have to start with that position? And of course, as the title is saying, it's foremost European frame of reference, taking into account European situation in 2008, 2007, 2008. But again, still quite a good reference, which could be used in Europe, but as well as outside Europe. What we do have is a plan, but it's still, I must say, plan. We didn't start to work on that, is to do something similar, which is quite demanding, but on a world scale. So trying to look to do the new frame of reference, which could be relevant for entire world. And this is, of course, much more demanding, as I said before, because different regions, not only continents, but different regions on different continents are indeed not the same, not in the same demand, and as well as they are not having the same kind of, let's say, thinking of how structure within museum regarding different position supposed to be organized. The next one, please. So, of course, as again, we saw some of the question, who is the museum professional? And that was discussion in 2018. To have idea of that, at the beginning, you need to know what is museum. And then only after that, you can easily say, well, not easily at all. But that's the beginning to know what is museum. And then after that, you can discuss about who is museum professional. And hopefully, after the general triennial conference in Prague this year, we will have new definition about what is museum. But what is not changing, I will say, no matter, or in general, no matter how we define what is museum and who is museum professional, is definition of professional training. So museums are, and they will remain, no question about, quite complex organism with a responsibility to perform a diverse set of tasks and services to fulfill its societal roles. And that will remain as a part of museum definition. So within the museum field, professional training is internal as well as external. And some of colleagues already in a way commented that to the museum. It is provided as initial training by university degrees in museum studies, heritage management, conservation, art, curatorship, or any other specialized areas where developing skills and competencies continues when people begin and develop their careers. Of course, this list of university degrees is not fixed and could go on, but it starts with usually with university degrees and then need to continue later on. So professional training is an ongoing process and can be provided in-house and also by additional training course managed by either museum association, different agency, consultants, including ICOM and ICTAP2. Within ICOM, the International Committee for Training of Personnel, US, aims to promote professional training at all levels in all regions of the world, as I said before. This development goes hand in hand with the promotion of good practice and the highest standards of the profession. The next one, please. Well, this is actually the last one. So I'm sure I'm not following completely the chat at the moment. I will translate it on my own later on after my presentation and then done some reaction if there's some question, because I'm sorry, I do not speak French, so not easily for me to follow without assistance of Google or somebody similar. But maybe to explain that, of course, ICTAP and we people which are part of ICTAP are not kind of experts who knows everything. So we see ourselves as a global hub to encourage and promote training programs related to museum or heritage studies. So any kind of, and when I'm saying a global hub, it's more like, you know, if you have the question, if you have a need, if you want to have some advice, you can address us. And we will, because of our network, find either someone who is the member of ICTOP or somebody who is outside, not officially member of, maybe not even the member of ICOM, if that's the case, but who knows and who have experience to assist you. So this is actually what is our power. This is the network of foremost within ICOM, of course, but as I said, even outside of ICOM if necessary. So our network is our full power to assist. Again, no question, is it the very small museum in Panama, or is it big museum on some other part of the world? And we are trying to do that at our best. So that's all from my side. Maybe just the comment again, what I mentioned in short, and that's really what we saw as a part of discussion today. There's a huge difference, of course, in between not only regions, but the size of museum. And for example, in Croatia, quite a lot, and Luis mentioned that too, quite a lot of museums are indeed extra micro museums. Many have, I'm working at the moment, for example, for a permanent exhibition of one, which have 2 people, director and curator. That's it. And they are actually not, but they are important regional museum in Croatian scale. So that scale of the size is extremely important to have that all the spectrum, and then looking at different kinds of situation, position, and role of the different stuff. If you have only one person, then that person is all. And it's, of course, again, in Croatia, I'm pretty sure in many other parts, if not in all other parts of the world, when those particular museum need something to do as a part of conservation, there's a bigger museum which is in a way responsible or have obligation to assist the smaller one as a part of entire hierarchical structure. So I'm stopping here, open to any comments. I will check, as I said, comments in chat, but I'm open to comments or discussion later on. Looking forward for it. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup, Darko Babic, pour cette présentation.
Thank you very much, Darko, for this presentation that gives us the general context. And thank you very much to all of our other speakers. And you have given us a real wide range of information. We would now like you to be able to respond to the presentations that have been given. Darko Babic, perhaps we could start by asking you a question. You presented a general overview and you did insist on the fact that there's differences depending on the region, depending on the size of the museum, depending on the collection. But with the examples that you heard today, has that given you something to perhaps flesh out this overview with regard to the articulation between the different professionals, for instance?
Well, I could try, of course. Not even within ICTOP, we don't have overview all around the world. We are becoming more and more aware. For example, I was never aware before our conference in Vietnam. I was not aware there is a quite good museum study programs in that part of the world. Then, Caucasus region, for example, again, very good example of the museum study programs there. If I go back again, as I try to explain, we are not saying people what they need to do. So going around like policemen and saying, no, you're supposed to do that differently. We are listening to the people and according to their question, to their input, we are adapting what we are offering to them. For example, that Malaysia workshop was at the beginning, we ended up contacted by the colleagues from Asian European Museum Network, and they informed us that people in the region do need the strong workshop on management, collection management and care. And then we invited a colleague from the Holland, who is working at the Reinventing University, discuss what is the time slot, what is the task, and so on, and deliver together with her the training there. In a sense of discussing different profession, I will say, well, different profession within museum profession. I would say that personally, I think all of them are important, and not all of them are equally maybe important. I personally deliver heritage marketing as a part of our master in museology and heritage management. So I fully agree with Luis. The beginning of every museum work is collection, and the end of every museum collection work is connected with the collection. In between, many things are important too. So some of them sometimes are not or only partly connected with collection, but they are still important. If you want to have what is today expected from the museums, you need to have it. Not necessarily you need to have it in-house. That's very true. For example, we saw in Croatia and other parts of the world too, in the last 20 years, we saw quite a lot of that importance of marketing, public relation, and so on. I would say, yeah, that's important, but not necessarily you need to have a department with your museum. You know, city, for example, where there is a 10 or 15 museums, would have 1 or 2 museum marketing and public relation experts who could serve all of them. You know, for conservation, I cannot completely the same, but again, in some situation, you will have the same starting position. Because small museum cannot have in-house conservator. If you organize that work very well, you know, and that's supposed to be responsibility of Ministry of Culture or some responsible museum, state museum agency, then that could work. So, not saying, to be precise, I'm not saying anything against I'm fully in favor. Without collection, there is no museum, and care of collection, and that's the part of conservation and so on, is extremely important, because otherwise we will lost it over the time by the influence of the weather and so on. But I'm still, I will not say or will not be in favor saying, you know, the rest is not important. If I reply to your question, not in detail, but from my point of view, which is slightly chaotic, I know.
Thank you. Est-ce que peut-être parmi les autres intervenants, vous auriez
So, are there any other speakers that would like to say anything, or perhaps do you have any questions that you would like to ask the other panelists? I would love to say something, just to say that I really do agree with what Darko Babic was saying. In some institutions, there are permanent professionals at the heart of the museum, whether they're conservators, curators, registrars, collection technicians, regardless of their position. And it's the characteristic of certain large institutions. And I do believe that they have the responsibility and the duty to provide technical, ethical, and logistic support to smaller institutions. I would consider that the Musée du Quai Branly is a large department. So we support other museums on the issue of acquisition, for instance, and exports outside of the EU. And internally, we consider that as conservator restorers, we have a duty to support people. Sometimes people contact us through the museum website with very complex questions, and it is our role and our duty to respond to that. Marianne Lepère, I would also like to specify that for the École de la Musique, we have reactivated a network across France and Europe. We're trying to be there to support other schools with our expertise. I agree with what Eleanor said. This is our duty. We are fortunate to have in-house personnel and to have this core team, and we need to help other people with that. Thank you very much. I believe that somebody has mentioned ICTOP in the chat. Do you have any questions? Alors, this is a question from an association perspective. I am part of the association of Radar, and we have carried out a number of events with registrar studies across Europe, training programs in place in France since 2018, masters from the École du Louvre and the Cahors, for instance, are not very common for our European colleagues. So as a member, it would be interesting to talk with ICTOP about this more specific perspective about registrar professions.
Merci Anne-Laure. Je pense que c'est peut-être l'occasion de poser des questions à Suzanne qui, outre...
Thank you, Anne-Laure. I think this might be the opportunity to ask a question to Suzanne, because given her experience as an independent conservator, perhaps she could talk to us a bit about the work done as part of the consortium that she was been part of in terms of identifying the different skills required and the different training levels required. Suzanne, are you still here?
Yes, I am. And it's been fascinating listening, and especially the last one about ICTOP. And in fact, I took screenshots too, because yes, Charter is the consortium, I suppose you're talking about, where we're trying to map skills and competences in the heritage sector. And I think it's very interesting now to say that, you know, my background too comes out of ECHO, which I was involved in for a long time, and you know, trying to express the voice of the conservator restorer, and the role of the conservator restorer in the beginning was simply that, explaining and trying to defend it. And more, and as you know, the work in ECHO evolved, it became very clear that it really had to be also contextualized within heritage, and what do we understand by heritage. So ultimately this came about in Charter, because one of the issues was in trying to also identify the conservator restorer in the range of economic activity that happens in cultural heritage. In the statistical frameworks, heritage is only represented strictly, I suppose, as museums, galleries, and archives, as places rather than the people and the activities that occur in heritage. And so it is interesting just looking at the types of courses that ICTOP then just put up, the range of activities that we're now addressing in heritage, which has come about as a much broader and expanded view of what heritage is. And so, yes, we have our collections, we have our heritage assets to take care of, to promote, to explain, to interpret, but we also have heritage as dynamic, as how we are in the world. It's heritage as phenomenon. And this is something tricky when we've come to map what it is that we do. And we have borrowed, and this is how I would describe it, that heritage and the way we think about it is hybrid. Its heritage is cultural praxis. It belongs to every aspect of every part of our lives. And at a political level, in every ministry that we have, we all create our own heritages. And they don't simply belong in museums, which is specific, yes, maybe to collections, but museums now have a new dynamic as well. Yes, to understand their collections and to mind them. But I think in this age of social media as well, we have to be very careful about fake news. And I think our collections, how we interpret them, what they speak to in terms of our histories, in terms of our pasts, and it's really, really important. And I think mediating heritage, interpreting heritage have become really to the forefront of how we think about ourselves. And so the conservator's role has had to be contextualized by this as well. It's not simply enough in the early days of conservation to explain it as we stabilize objects and we keep them for the future, and we protect them. There's preventive conservation, and there's many different types of conservation. But we are also now looking as to the role of what conservation plays in how an understanding of heritage is also mediated, how the objects are explained, and how far we ourselves carry interventions and meaning. And that very interesting, that exhibition that you just showed, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the person, about the hidden meanings of objects, the taboos around them, and the cultural meanings of objects that are really, all of that is really coming to the fore in how we go about conservation. And again, how multidisciplinary the nature of heritage practice has become because of this very transversal nature that it has, that it is cultural praxis, I suppose is how I would describe it. And that this has become more and more aware and of how we all perform and how we are interdisciplinary. And I think that's one of the really important growth areas of heritage, less hierarchical too in how institutions are run. It's been incredibly interesting to listen to the multidisciplinary nature that's already occurring and how advanced it is that you're working in teams. And you see, this is the problem between big collections and small collections, small museums who don't have access sometimes. And a lot of them are local to local towns and villages. And it's very important to sense of identity and sense of place. And these people need access to this thinking, whereas you'll usually find it's the one person who's cleaning the toilets, opening up the museum, running around. I mean, I see this as well from local small museums to the very big collections. They go in and you really almost have a personal relationship with even the community that is trying to run a heritage center or their local museum. And as a charter is about trying to identify what is that dynamic as heritage practice. And it starts from allowing communities to engage in their own heritage because they have the skills and the knowledge, to at what point does this become professional practice? And this is another difficulty, and it's a challenge for Charter to be inclusive and to say what the skills are in a ratio of learning that is also professional, as opposed to just competences that we all have to author our own heritages. And this is, I hope I'm making this clear, but this is a challenge for Charter to be inclusive, to show what the dynamic of public participation is, not simply as passive, going and engaging and looking, but as also in choosing how, in the authorship of our heritages, how that arrives into museums and how that arrives into places where we care for our heritage. Does that make sense?
Oui, tout à fait. Et je crois que ça rejoint un petit peu.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that really does connect in very well to the conclusion that Luis made. Luis might have something to say about this intersection between collections and the public. Would you like to respond to this at all, Luis? This question of the investment of the public in conservation. The public needs to become a participant in conservation, not just about contemplating works, but also being involved. Yes. To be honest, I don't think I have much to say, really. Of course, public needs to be involved in all levels of the museum. But we need to understand as well that there is real expertise with regard to the collections. As an archaeologist, I'm a bit concerned about this transformation of an object into a museum object, because for us, an object is dirty by nature. It comes out of the ground. It comes from passed by hand to hand, and then we tidy it up and we clean it up. And conservators are very careful, of course, in how they do this. And I have to be honest, all of that kind of, I feel a bit awkward about. I feel a bit unsure about it. I understand it. I understand this reality. Of course, the public is very welcome, particularly in order to highlight the priority of managing collections, because of course collections belong to everybody. Everybody has something to say about the priorities of management of collections, not only technicians. Perhaps if I could just add something else as well, which has not really been raised yet. I think most of us here are French. I'm speaking French, although I usually speak English within ICOM. But I'm speaking French here because I think most participants speak French. But I wonder, it's a sort of rhetorical question, I've got my answer, but do you think that in France, why do we have the separation between conservators on one side and restorers on the other side in terms of this approach? Because everywhere else in Europe, even in countries like mine, I'm from Portugal, where we follow French culture quite a lot in museums, we talk a lot about conservator restorers together. And so my question is really, why does France maintain this distinction, which is really quite unusual? And my answer is that in France, there is still training of conservators as it was in the past. And I really think that is very important, that old style training. What we're seeing in a number of countries, the classical training of conservators is being abandoned. we are training museologists now in universities. I don't really know what that is. We're not training conservators anymore in English-speaking countries. That's a particular case, and now perhaps more and more having an impact in a whole range of cultures. But I think that the role of conservators is really essential. I think that they were trained in the past even more. They were trained practically, not just through theoretical training that they obtain at university. The training of conservators, in addition to the training of curators, which is a main focus in English-speaking countries, there's a lack of training, of university training, and then practical training within museums of traditional conservators is leaving a gap, because there is still a need which are now fulfilled by conservator restorers. I know there is a sociological issue here with regard to conservators and restorers. I know that there was a sociological question, or maybe there still is, a prestige issue, but we can't think in that way anymore. I think that restorers are filling the gap now left by the lack of training for traditional conservatives. That's just my perspective. So I can see that people are starting to raise their hands. I can see that Suzanne Cor and Juliette Raoul Duval would like to speak. Maybe there are other participants. Perhaps there are other conservators in the French sense of that word who are in the room today. I see Suzanne Cor, you were first, so would you like to speak?
Yes, I would actually, because I'm not sure I understand Luis. I don't know whether he understands a little of what he's talking about there. Maybe I'm being very provocative too, but I think we need to clear terms here. And this is a very old story. Conservateur in France is curator. It is a legally protected title. And we have been assured at all times when we're dealing with France in ECHO, that conservateur is the curator. The conservator restorer is now the conservator as we know it. And the training for the conservator restorer, and I would just like to think, I think it's nice of Europe because there are very old traditions, guild traditions of restoration, but restoration is a particular moment in conservation. I think we've all come to accept that, and that the conservation is is a paradigm of care ultimately, which is about both stabilization and protection, and restoration is a point of intervention beyond that. Maybe in Eastern Europe still there is a tradition of where restoration is also seen as a creative pursuit, but it is intellectually, conservation restoration is actually intellectually creative. But a conservateur in France is the curator, and there isn't a gap really between a difference between the practicing professional conservator restorer. I mean, I just don't know of anybody else that exists. It is the same as the conservator in America as such, or the UK, that they prefer to go with the term conservator as well. And I think certainly ECHO respects the old traditions that have come together to create the conservator restorer, and it's encompassed there. France is different because conservateur is a legally protected title. And I do not think it reflects, I mean, a loss or a split in training. I think the curators must have their own training, and the conservator restorer exists in France as well. Eleanor can answer that one better, but I don't think there's a gap in between that is not being addressed. And just to say that again, going back to the statistical frameworks wherein we're represented as restorers, it is very much to arts and crafts and to creativity in the arts field that the restorer is, at the moment, is coded under, and that is not the conservator. In fact, there is a huge gap in collecting data on the work of the conservator, and as Echo calls it, the conservator restorer. And let me just say, I don't mind it being called the conservator restorer because I respect the tradition, I suppose, that Europe has. It's again, it's hybrid. Everything in heritage is a hybrid activity. Maybe that helps. And Eleanor might like to say what she calls herself as a conservator in English and in French.
Well, I call myself a conservateur-restaurateur, sometimes just to shorten it, also a restaurateur. Sometimes I feminize it as conservatrice-restauratrice or restauratrice. It depends. Whatever I call myself is based on a very deep knowledge of what I know and what I am, what my competences are. And in the end, what we need is a protected title in France, if only to clear the quid pro quo that might exist in our own language between conservateur, restaurateur, and conservateur. But I think what we need to focus on is concepts and competencies and training and long life learning. That's what I would say.
There are very defined competences that belong to both. I don't think there's something in the middle. I don't understand where that gap lies, because I think there are very clear competences.
Alors, je crois que Juliette voulait réagir aussi, et Darko Babic, justement.
Juliette wanted to respond, and Darko Babic as well, with regard to skills. Thank you, Pauline. I just wanted to respond to what Luis said, because I very often agree with him, and I agree with him again. In terms of what he said just recently, a moment ago, this is a really very important question within ICOM. We've gone round this question today, this question of what is a museum professional? In ICOM, we are an organization of museum professionals. At least we are seeking to be a organization of museum professionals, but not everybody agrees with that definition. And there's a way of saying this where we have people who work within museums, people who work for museums, and people who work on museums. And I think what Luis is saying is that we have university academics who work on universities. They understand the sociology of museums, and our organization ICOM, for our organization ICOM, they have a place, a role, they have an increasing place. And over the years, we've talked a lot about the definition of museum. And this question is a question that we're asking, of course, and we've asked this question thought about this question with Eleanor Kissel and the Federation of Conservators, Restorers. When we do not work within a museum, can we be considered a museum professional, at least within the sense of ICOM, which would allow these people to be members of ICOM? This is an important question, and I don't think we've yet got to the end of this debate. We are still asking this question about whether you have to work in a museum to be a museum professional, or whether you can work for a museum. So that was the first thing that I would like to say. That's what I hear very clearly in Luis's question. And at ICOM, and ICOM France, we've thought a lot about this question, about what is it to be a museum professional today? In terms of the French Federation of Conservators Restorers have wanted to take part in this debate that we had in France, because it's perhaps hard to understand this debate outside of France, but this debate has to go beyond France. This question of whether it's important to have a protected title, whether the title is important or not. Of course, I was part of supporting this approach, and I want to see a recognition of this role, because I think that we are exemplary in terms of the conception of the importance of collections. We have always wanted to be clear that collections are at the heart of museums, but that's not the case everywhere in the world. I think that at least 40% of our participants tonight are not French. And I think that when you're not impacted by the complexity of this question, I think it's hard to understand that the central place of collections within museums is not shared everywhere in the world. I think, dear colleagues, we need to understand this. This is why it's so important that our colleague from ICTOP is here with us. And that is why inviting professionals who think that this question is important to not hesitate to become members of ICOM and to take position and to get involved in the international ICTOP committee, for example. And I can have the opportunity to mention this, that there will be a conference this summer. The direction and the organization of ICOM is likely to change soon, and if you're interested, it's the time to let it be known, is to get to know our colleague, our honorable colleague from ICTOP, because, dear conservator restorers, it's time for you to take a place within our organization. I think when I was asked by our friends from Museum Association, I was talked to them about the fact you're going to work as well in other countries, and it's important that your skills are recognized beyond France, and that the titles that we have and that we represent, it's important they are recognized. We are now in a world where there are museums everywhere, and the conservation of collections is the heart of all of our work, not just a single country. So it seems really very important for us to think about this question of what is a museum professional today. What does it mean to have a professional title that is recognized and understood by everyone, not only in France? I thought it was important to speak.
So I'd just like to leave enough time for Baco Babic and then Juan Carlos to speak. So Darko, over to you.
Thank you. Shortly, I saw the question in the chat about that we are not, as ICTOP, so active in America. That's true, and not to avoid the answer, that's true. Sometimes it's coincidence. Part of coincidence here is because we didn't have so many members coming from North or South America, but I hope it will change in the next 2 years as because of some preliminary agreements, but very, very preliminary. About discussion, what we are saying now, I do completely agree, and I could add even more, one more level, and that's it. For example, if you have community initiative of people who are doing some kind of museum, which we could recognize as a museum, but if they want to be accredited as museum, I'm speaking here about the case in Croatia, quite sure it is similar in many other countries with the different examples. If they want to be accredited museum, they need to follow Museum Act, museum law, which is done by Ministry of Culture. If they, some of them, and this is happening more and more, if they decide that the demands by Ministry, by Museum Act is so high and they cannot cover, they will not be in position to cover it. They will not have enough staff, they will not have enough funds to do all that. They decide not to be official museum. So if they are not official museum, can we call those people museum professionals? That's another level of discussion about this is indeed within the law, but it could be another tricky part to see perspective within Europe, all around the world, how to recognize who is and who is not museum professional. That's just another level which extra complicate the situation. And what Luis mentioned about museum studies or museology study programs, I'm working on one of them, so I will react in that sense. In a way, I will say, if you want to have strong profession and really strong profession, then you need specialized education for that. And that's one way how you do it. And that's actually how partly ICTOP and ICOFOM even more started in late 80s, late 60s, and then 70s, because of that looking for recognition of the profession. You know, like architects have the faculty of architecture. After that, you are architect and you know who you are. Again, university programs do help in that sense. Beside, of course, idea that if you are engaged, if you are following the museum study, museology study program, then you will have overview of all different tasks going on in museum, and not only your, so to say, small part. So sometimes it's very important, but you are not, you know, you are aware that conservation is important. You are aware that visitor politics is important. You are aware that marketing is important. You are aware that, I don't know, something else is important too. You are not doing all of that, but you are well aware all that segments are important for overall museum work. So in that sense, I would say, you know, developing even more could be important. And again, what I'm saying several times, it is again a matter of the scale and the region and so on. In case of Croatia, in my case at my university, we have Master of Museology and Heritage Management. Why we do have both? Because Croatia is quite small, you know, and our students, you know, could go to work as a museum staff, museum curators, or could do something with a heritage tourism, different kind of any association connected with heritage. In case of Croatia, that's reality, you know. In case of Germany, probably not. In case of, I don't know, then some Costa Rica could be completely different. And again, it's you need to look at the local scale, no matter what. And differences will always exist. Within ICTOP, that's my last point. Within ICTOP, we at one point discussed, do we need to look, is there any kind of the global museum study program? Is it possible to do a global museum study program? Or it's better to look at the 5, 10, 15, I don't know how many different regional museum study programs. And I think majority of us concluded the one global, it's not the right way to think about that. So at the beginning, looking at, we will have different, and that will better fit today world than having only one. Thanks.
Merci Darko. Alors,
Thank you very much, Darko. I'm going to hand over to Mr. Juan Carlos Ferdinand. Thank you. Good evening. I hope that you can hear me properly. I will be speaking in Spanish. Thank you very much, all of you, to Luis and to all of you. It is a real pleasure for me to be taking part in this event that is organized by ICOM France on the topic that we have been talking about today. We have been certified as a heritage city, and we have a technology university, but we no longer have a study program for museologists, conservators, or curators here in the region. The University of Columbia has also closed its programs, so you can see how difficult it is. Over 300 students trained to be conservator in museology are experts not in just one subject, but in many subjects linked to restoration, because we had a general study program for wall painting, sculpture, metals, stone, marble, etc. All of these specialities, we have seen this in the careers of our students. I was a specialist in museology and I studied restoration in part, but without working in that field later. So what you're saying as well is that if we were to have a degree, yes, that would be great, in order to support professionals working in museums. An artist cannot be a restorer, a conservator, you know this. They will be leaving works like they were 20 years ago, but conservators are conserving the memory of history, and we cannot mix the two. They have to respect the history of the work. And if we talk about studies for conservators, there needs to be respect for the work. And the study program will talk about whether or not someone will need to remove a coat of varnish, for instance. An artist won't know that. An architect is not a conservator. They may have some information, but they won't know how to manage cultural issues. And that's what's happening in Ecuador and around the world. So that's what I wanted to say. To finish, whether in France or any other European country, we would love you to support us to create the career of conservator in Ecuador again. We have 3 universities that would really love your support and your financial help. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this testimony, and we would love to know why these study programs have closed down. We would perhaps be able to continue this discussion, but I would like to turn to Juliette now. I know that Amélie is going to be locked into the INP if she does not leave now. Are there any final questions or reactions from the public? Would anybody else like to say anything out loud or in the chat? Is that it for this evening? Juliette? I think this debate could continue for a very long time still, and the wealth of exchange has shown us how important this is. I would especially like to thank our colleague from Ecuador for your last statement there. this is at a very opportune moment at the end of the event to show what is important. It needed to be heard. One thing is that the level of debate is very different from one country to another. The way in which we can work on collections is very different from one country to another. And I think that this is what makes ICOM such an interesting organization. I'm very happy because for many years we've had debates between the INP and ICOM. We've discussed a great number of topics, fundamental and difficult topics, at the heart, at the crossroads of what the career, the profession actually is about. Museum professionals need to be need to be trained as curators or conservators, but we are a network where there is an awareness. We represent an extremely varied and diverse world with 90,000 museums across the world. Some are tiny, as Darko was saying earlier, and others are enormous, and they're overrepresented this evening in our discussion, perhaps. We are aware of that. And I think an organization like ICOM is unique because it has been around for 75 years and it has remained a professional organization for that entire time. And the heart of our organization is to have ethics, as we heard in the chat. That was its base at the start, to have this professional conscience every day and to reconcile collections and heritage. This is a humanitarian good. It's something that brings us together, an instrument of peace. And in an organization like our own, it is incredibly important to help one another. So it was important for us to have this debate. And what's important for our colleague from Ecuador is that he was able to express his difficulties and he's sharing that with us. He's telling us. I was going to start also by saying that our Ukrainian colleagues are asking. We were saying there are 20 museums in France that are happy to host museum professionals that would like refuge, but they said, no, that's not what we want. We want help to restore and to conserve our works. We want your help to allow us to exist, to conserve our memory, to remain a nation with a history. And for that, we want help from museum professionals for conserving our heritage. We have a profession here that's not just to keep the public happy. I agree with what Luis was saying. We talk a lot about public and the public, what they want. Do we have to ask their opinion on everything? Yes, we do work with the public and for the public. But we also have a responsibility as museums. People believe us when they come to visit a museum. And this is a duty. So we've thought together about how we can exercise this responsibility together. We have been asking questions in France, which are perhaps the questions of the privileged few of large museums. How can we best organize our structures? These are essential issues. But I've heard this message that we heard at the end, and we need to support one another. And that is the message that I would like to give at the end of this professional meeting. Thank you very much, Juliette. Thank you very much, one and all. Do we have another topic that has been announced for our next evening? Yes, we can announce this now. We have a lot of things to announce. Our General Assembly in Paris will be on the 23rd of September at the Musée du Quai Branly. A title has been selected. It will be very interesting. Who do collections belong to? So this will allow us to ask lots of extremely sensitive questions. I will be providing more information on this in the coming month. This will be a major moment for us. There is the General Assembly in Prague during the summer in August. As I said earlier, there will be a renewal of our international committee and our national committees. This is the moment for anybody interested to get some more information about how to get more involved. Anybody interested, I would like to say that there will be a Zoom session Monday at 5:30 p.m. in order to provide more precise information, especially for the French community, on how we will be organizing this collective event in Prague between the 22nd and 24th of August. Our friends from Prague will be there to explain the program to us. There will be some great highlights. Let me give you a few now. There will be a big emphasis on the museum definition. We've been working on this for 3 years now. This is not just a matter of semantics. What is the heart of our organization? Is it a professional organization? Is it a political organization? Make your decision. Get involved in this debate. And we also have an important topic that I only found out about this morning. I had a meeting this morning. It was around the decolonization of museums, which is the heart of ICOM. And at ICOM France, we will be leading debate, which I think will be extremely important, on multilingualism. And this evening, we have had an evening with the 3 official languages of ICOM. And I think that it is extremely important that the debates that we have are really led by others' views. We all have our own ways of thinking, but we have a lot to learn from each other. And I think that's what I would like to say in terms of the information. I'm sure I've forgotten some stuff, but that's everything I can think of for now.
Peut-être qu'on se dit toi, Pauline, de dire un mot. Qu'est-ce que tu as? Peut-être moi, je te pose une question à toi, Amélie.
Pauline, Emily, Eleanor, has this evening of debate as conservators, has it met your expectations? Do you have the feeling that there has been a real true debate this evening? Eleanor, I don't know if we can talk about a debate in the sense of something conflictual, not in that sense, but I was struck by the diversity of activities and the expression of the different professions that participated today, whether it was in the presentation of Olivier Gavet, Marianne Loperatia, we saw the multiplicity of professionals that gravitate around the collections, each with their own competencies and skills and qualifications, but always as part of a network, in a network with collection managers, sometimes more on the sidelines, such as legal advisors, for instance, as I mentioned, an advisor on the intellectual property for indigenous communities, and then local communities or collection communities, if we're talking about collections that were produced by others than ourselves. But there is a real resonance between France and its different professionals, and I found that very interesting.
De nous quitter.
Perhaps it's time to say goodbye. We will be very glad to read the publication that will come out after this event, and also to have feedback from our colleagues from all around the world. And their presence reminds us that we need to have a number of different angles. It's good to hear from Juan Carlos Fernandez, who says it's important to have this training of these different professions, of this commitment to materiality. We all have different contexts. We have different work, maybe sometimes intangible objects, but we have something to do around materiality. We're going to need to stop here because the interpreters will soon be having to stop. And we could, but I think we will come to an end here. Perhaps we could hear from one last person, but we'll have to wrap up quite soon. No, I was suggesting that we wrapped up there. That's a good place to stop, I think, unless anybody else really needs to say something. I think that leaves us room to talk next time. A good evening to everybody, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much. Thank you.